All right, so I can't say that I've known anyone who has entered a monastery at the age of 11 and wanted to become a monk. Anyone here? Yeah. I know that I've wanted to run to a monastery at times in my life, but that is what our next guest did, and he went on to lead an extraordinary life in the service of others. And it was at that monastery that Thupten Jinpa Langri met His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, who must have been struck by the brilliance, the intelligence, and the curiosity of this young student. Jinpa became his interpreter, and he has held that role since 1985. He is also the founder and president of the Compassion Institute and an adjunct professor at the School of Religious Studies at McGill University. He has many other credits, including translator and editor of numerous books by the Dalai Lama. He has also written several books of his own, including A Fearless Heart, How the Courage to be Compassionate Can Transform Our Lives. I'm so pleased to be able to have this conversation with him now about his remarkable life, his teachings, and also how we can lead a more satisfying and meaningful life. Please welcome Thupten Jinpa Langri. Oh, so nice. Thank you, Jinpa. So, Jinpa, I was saying that you entered the monastery at the age of 11. Now, why did that happen?
Well, like many Tibetan children of my age, with the first generation of refugees in India, and our parents had to make a living by working on road construction. So all the children were sent to boarding schools run by various non-profit agencies. So at the school, among the teachers, there were two monastic members who were teachers. And I was deeply inspired by them. They even looked physically radiant. And they had the best stories to tell, and they were very kind. So I think I was deeply impressed by them. And then later at a larger school, we had a group of monks who spent a month, and each class was assigned a teacher. And I was a little bored at that school. I wasn't challenged intellectually. But when we had monastic members assigned to each of the class, the monk who was assigned to my class, I was grade 4, he taught us elementary debate, which is kind of rational debate training. And I was fascinated by that. And then I just wanted to be just like them. So I did not know. Is
that where you learned how to speak English?
Yes, it was an English medium school, but it's quite basic. But so when I left school after grade 4, I was able to read. Couldn't speak, but I was at least able to read, yeah.
Yeah, because your facility with I read your book. I'm an English major. You speak English and write it better than I do.
Well, it's definitely a second language, even though that's the language of profession that I do, by serving His Holiness and working and translating. But it still is a second language for me. And, I've been very lucky to have good copy editors. And I still struggle once in a while with the usage of the definite article, the. So I have a simple rule: if in doubt, just use it.
What was life at the monastery like for you?
Well, when I first became a monk, I did not know what kind of monastery that I should have gone into, because I was inspired by the academic intellect of the monks who were at the school. I ended up in a small monastery, which was connected with my father's family. It's a native monastery. But in that monastery, there was not much intellectual activity. It was more of a ritual, chanting, memorization, and all of that. So again, it wasn't that intellectually stimulating. But eventually, I was able to go to an academic monastery, which is really kind of, I suppose, similar to theological seminary that one would expect in the West. There's a lot of academic scholarship, mastery of the key classical text, and the primary medium is really debate. So we spend, on an average, 2 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the evening, when it's cooler in South India, debating outside in the open courtyard. So there's the actual class is on an hour. There's only one session of an actual class with a teacher that you're supposed to read on your own. And then the real class is with your colleagues in the debating courtyard. So that's a powerful medium, and it's very physical. It's very action-oriented.
The debate is very physical?
One person is sitting down, one monk is standing up, and the one who's standing up is asking question. And every time you make a point, you clap your hand and you stomp your left foot. It's a very physical, and for a young boy, I mean, that's the perfect, because in typical traditional school, you expect to sit down, like coop up like this for an hour. But in the debating courtyard, it's very physical. It's actually very well designed pedagogical method, actually.
And so how long did you stay in the monastery?
Quite long. Yeah, I left I finished my formal Gishi training in '89, and then I went to Cambridge for 3 years to do undergraduate.
Yeah. And what was your decision you decided to leave the monastery?
No, not at that point. I mean, at that point in '85, I had the accidental kind of, honor to translate for His Holiness, and at that time there were very few monks who had facility with English. So I happened to be just one of those. And so when I began translating for him, I realized that at that point my English was very informal. I had taught myself basically by listening to BBC and reading, and so I needed to, in some sense, kind of iron it out, make it a bit more formal and refine it. So I thought going to a university would be a good thing. So that's my primary motivation at the time, was to, I suppose, learn some skills to be able to serve the Dalai Lama better. Yeah, so, but then later I decided to leave the monastery. Yeah.
And why was that?
Wanted a family. So, yeah, I left for boarding school when I was 4 years old, and then lost my mother when I was 9, and then never really had a family. And then I saw my uncle's family, my cousins, having a real family life. So I think there was a yearning for family. And in the Tibetan tradition, when you become a monk, you have to choose a celibate life. Mm-hmm. So I think that yearning for family never really went away. So then I had to make a decision before it's not too late,
Wow. And your life has revolved around compassion. You founded the Compassion Institute. Can you talk about that from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, the importance of empathy and compassion?
Well, in the Tibetan tradition, compassion as a key value is front and center. So, every Tibetan Buddhist chants a mantra, or Mani Padme Hum, which is a 6-syllable mantra, and it's the mantra of Buddha of Compassion. And Buddha of Compassion, envisioned in the form of a 1,000-armed deity with 1,000 eyes, one eye on each of these, there's a kind of a powerful mythology, like the story of Christ on the cross. There's a powerful mythology, and it's all about compassion. And then Dalai Lama, he's the 14th one. They are also seen as human manifestations of compassion. So compassion is really front and center in the culture. And then also from the kind of a theological or religious point of view, compassion and wisdom are the core principles of the religion. So that, I think, is an important point. And then my own personal interest really came from seeing for the Dalai Lama, the central message that he is bringing to the outside world is really compassion. And he talks about secular ethics. Secular ethics is more of a universal approach to ethics and compassion. And one work that I came to appreciate that he has done is to really extract the language of compassion out of traditional religious context and even the context of morality, and really bring it at the level of understanding of basic human condition. So today we talk about empathy and compassion as being part of natural human condition. This is fairly new. This is fairly
from research?
Well, from the research and from the scientific idea, because up until recently, the dominant picture of human nature was a very specific formulation of Darwinian evolutionary theory, where ultimate impulse or motivation of human behavior was understood in terms of a pursuit of self-interest.
Right.
And even scientists would reject the reality of something like compassion and altruism and empathy as being truly real sentiments. And they might be social, religious kind of values imposed upon the basic human nature, which needs to be controlled. And that was the main, kind of basic model. And this is one area where the Dalai Lama has really made an impact to really kind of bring the language of compassion and empathy at the level of basic human nature. And now even the evolutionary science accepts it, grudgingly, because you can't explain away empathy. Especially if you see empathy among non-human primates. This is where animal research has shown. Some of you may have seen, apes, when two juveniles fight and one of them loses, another friend who's not blood relation comes and comforts. That's a consolation behavior. Consolation behavior is actually quite complex. It presupposes an empathy on the part of the person, the animal who's giving the consolation, understands the situation and the pain, and is comforting. So if you see empathy in non-human primates, you cannot say empathy is imposed by religion or ethics. So I think those are revolutionary ideas that have really changed the way even science understands human nature. And empathy is one of the most powerful expression of that social dimension of who we are.
What do you think has happened with empathy and compassion because of the pandemic?
Well, I think I worry a lot about, especially children. Very young children, when they grow up in the kindergarten age and the first few grades, this is when they are given a social context in which they are able to interact with their same age groups, to really acquire the social skills, because empathy as a basic quality is there, but empathy needs to be expressed. And often that expression requires negotiating your needs and others' needs, and understanding other, social awareness is an important part of, self-awareness is about your own emotion. Social awareness is about understanding others', emotions, and empathy is at the core of that awareness. So I think what has happened, unfortunately, at least for over 2 to 3 years during the pandemic, is that whole generation of children have been robbed of that opportunity. And we don't know at this point what the consequences are going to be. And many, mental health professionals are really worried. What would that be? So I think, I wish and I hope many parents are, going to be able to watch this event and really take serious note about the importance of empathy and Roots of Empathy's work, to be able to, sort of make it up, because what has been lost can be made up through a conscious, proactive, effort by schools and parents to really making sure that the children acquire those skills, social skills, to be able to express. Because last thing you want is suppression of empathy. When you suppress empathy, it turns out there's a research that shows that one of the main factors for burnout is a suppression of empathy. And this is particularly coming from the healthcare literature, so research, like the physicians particularly. In order to protect themselves, if they choose the route of, because if you are overextended in your empathy, that's another source for burnout. It's emotional exhaustion. But the other extreme is also not good for you. It may initially work, which is to suppress, but it turns out that's also, they call it depersonalization, which is to turn the person into a number, like a patient in room 5 or something like that, and not use the empathic human response. So it turns out that suppression of empathy is also another source of burnout. So we have to somehow, recognize that empathy is one of the most beautiful qualities of who we are as a social creature. And, we have to, of course, regulate it. We cannot be completely in that emotional response all the time, but shutting it out and suppressing it is actually very detrimental. And this is one area where I think coming out of pandemic, schools and parents, particularly of young children, really need to pay special attention.
Yeah, I've spoken to a number of psychiatrists and psychologists who they've said that there were things that had already been happening with children and that the pandemic exacerbated it. And there's a term that's been used, the anxious generation, which refers to, I guess, sort of millennials and Gen Z. And that they're seeing more and more young children, and this has now been going on for years before the pandemic, who are extremely anxious and depressed, and they've been seeing a rise in this. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, about why these children and young people are so anxious and so worried.
Well, I'm not a social scientist, so I can't really kind of talk about.
Is this something you would?
I mean, I do, think a lot about this.
Yeah.
My own sense is that, if you look at the rise of anxiety among, younger generation, it seems to coincide with the rising popularity of social media. So that I think there is a correlation there. To what extent it's a contributory factor, we don't know. But the challenge of digital kind of relationship is that it robs the interaction. When humans interact in person, there are a lot of communications and interactions that are actually non-verbal. We are very smart social creatures. We catch people's tone, sadness, happiness, whatever it is, we then adapt. It's almost like a beautiful dance, and we do it subconsciously. We don't have to consciously think, I'm going to, if he says that I'm going to do this, if she says that I'm going to, we don't have to think. We do it naturally. When you take out the in-person physical interaction, all of that is gone. And people say a lot about Zoom and FaceTime and all of this, but even there's a little time lapse. They're not fast enough. So what you see is not really real time. So we are not there yet. So then you only see face. You don't see, and then you don't catch the tone. So this is one of the reasons why anxiety has gone up, because generally we seek comfort from others, whether family or friends, and our regulation of stress is not simply, I know as a Buddhist and myself a meditation practitioner, I think the world of meditation, but relying on meditation as a way of calming stress, meditation alone is a bad strategy. We are better off regulating our stress and anxiety by relationships. It's a way more powerful. Parents who have been parents will know that a young child, a 2 to 3 year old, who is completely worked up and distressed and screaming, there's nothing more powerful than just giving a big hug. No amount of talking is to make a difference. Just holding their child, hugging for a while, does the job. So I think that all of that, the younger generation, unfortunately, miss out. And they choose, even if they are next to each other, they are texting. That's just horrible. So all of that, I think, is part of the contributory factor, so the anxiety. And this is one area where programs like Roots of Empathy, which really allows young children to step out of their shell, be there in presence of a young, vulnerable child whose needs and stresses and distress is immediate and real, is very powerful. Because now there's a new research that shows a large part of the healing power, even in mindfulness meditation research, really comes from a phenomenon called self-transcendence. When you are able to go beyond yourself, when you are able to step out of your narrow shell, that's where the power comes. Healing, sense of greatness, and deep connection. So I think programs like Roots of Empathy, which really explicitly allows children to express their natural empathy, the reason why it's powerful is because it allows that opportunity, without having to instruct them. Now you think like this, now you think like that, now you think like that. That is tough. But if you create an experience where these things happen, self-transcendence happen naturally, it is powerful. So I think younger generation, they really need to think seriously about who we are as social creatures. In the end, large part of our happiness and suffering has to do with relationship with others. That's a fact. And
that relationship with, it's tricky. I think many of us, we want to be empathic, and it may be easier to be empathic with people we identify with.
Sure.
And coming out of the pandemic, we see more divisiveness,
Sure.
right? And I think there's a real test, and I can say for me too, when I want to be empathic, but it's with someone who has such opposing views, even fundamental values, right, that are in conflict with mine, and I struggle to find the empathy. How do I find the empathy, right, with people? And not only that, but even I might feel that their values are dangerous to mine.
True. Well, I think even with very diametrically opposed views, values I'm not quite sure, but views, if you dig deeper, they tend to come from a similar place. You have a different vision of how the society should be structured, what is good for your community, what matters to you. So in the end, often the very, very heated, diametrically opposed views tend to be about means to get there. It's not really the objectives and aims themselves. So I think there's a possibility of that. That's why it's very difficult to really try to have empathy at the level of the differences itself. But in order to allow your empathy to express, you need to find something that is common. Because empathy requires us to identify and connect and understand. Mm-hmm. And for that, there needs to be some commonality. So we need to go several layers down, and then at some level we will find that commonality. And we may completely disagree with the approach the other person is taking. So being empathetic does not mean you approve what the other person is proposing. In some cases, you actually have to take a very tough stand. But you can at least understand where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. So that's unless you get there, I don't think you can have empathy. Mm-hmm. It's difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, I think people too, we see a lot of anger today, right? Even public anger. Sure. Do you ever get angry?
Yes, of course.
So how do we manage anger? When we rise right to the occasion,
sure.
we get upset. Then other people start getting angry. Now we're into it.
Sure. I think anger itself. Now I may be getting here in a little dangerous territory, but anger itself is a very natural, healthy emotion. It has an evolutionary role to play. Anger arises when we are frustrated because we are not, achieving what we want to. And anger arises, in Buddhist psychology, it says that anger arises as a response when you're confronted with the obstacles for achieving, trying to do what you want to do. An obstacle comes up, anger arises as a response. So anger has this protective, and it also brings energy. But the problem with anger is that it also tends to bring a blindness with it. That is what the problem is. And anger as an initial response, like for example, moral outrage is a form of anger. Moral outrage is a healthy response to an injustice. If you don't have, and because moral outrage arises when you feel someone is really doing something that you completely, against your moral value. And it's a healthy response. But then where you need a little bit of discernment is to make sure that anger does not then linger on and translate into resentment and hatred. That's when the ugly side of anger comes in. So anger as a powerful initial response to bringing the energetic response can be healthy. But it's very difficult to bring the awareness immediately after to make sure that you tap into the energy, but then you don't go into this darker route, which is the resentment, vengeance. And then, the actual behavioral expression of that is you just want to smash everything down. So this is where sometimes the kind of, the activism, when it is totally carried over by anger, then activism ends up becoming just an expression of vengeance, and they just don't care what happens afterwards. They just want to smash down what they don't like, So I think, I think anger naturally is a very healthy emotion, but you just have to keep an eye. And one of the problems now is in social media. it provides a bullhorn. So sometimes, outrage feeds on another outrage. Then it creates an echo chamber. Then in the process, then you don't quite know what it was all about to begin with, and everybody participates in that expression of outrage. That's when things get lost.
In your book, you talked about loneliness, and you said that it is one of the most painful forms of suffering. And I think that is another area, the pandemic, it certainly heightened people's loneliness. Can you talk about that and how we alleviate?
Well, loneliness is it's a very strange psychological experience, because when you're lonely, it's not that, being alone and being lonely are two different things. You can be in a crowd, you can be with a large family and feel very lonely. So I think being alone and being lonely are two different things. In loneliness, the key element of that is a feeling of alienation, disconnection. And that is quite unhealthy, because, feeling connected with someone in your life is crucial for mental well-being. And loneliness really undermines that. So that's why paying attention to loneliness, making sure that, and there are a lot of things we can do, because sometimes in the West, we prize autonomy as a key value. We even go to the extent of making sure we don't depend on people, we have created that structure, and it has a lot of strength. But in the process, sometimes we go to an extreme where we don't leave room for others. Because in order to care for connection, in order to nurture relationship, you have to make a little bit of fuss about other people's feelings and other people's needs. And then you have to accept that there's an element of messiness. When you're only obsessed with your own autonomy and living this life alone, it's neat, it's clean, It's less messy, but it's also less rich. Yeah. So relationships comes with a little bit of mess, but that's okay. And that's very human. But in an aggregate, you stand to gain a lot more by connecting, being open, creating room for others. And that's where I think, something like empathy and compassion and creating space for others is the best way to prevent loneliness. Because loneliness kills, actually, because they are medical scientists are telling us that loneliness is as worse than cigarette smoking as a killer. I mean, it's dangerous. Kind of a persistent chronic loneliness is dangerous.
We're almost out of time. I'm sorry to say I had so many other questions, but I wonder if we could talk about death. Not to be morbid, but in your book, you talked about the questions and thoughts that occupy our minds at the end of our lives, and I thought that was really, really interesting. What would you think about at the end of your life?
Well, I mean, I have been a Tibetan Buddhist my entire life. There's a saying in the Tibetan tradition that true test of your spiritual growth is how you feel at the point of your death. When you look back, and have you lived your life with purpose? Have you made a difference in someone's life? Have you been compassionate? I think those are key questions. And the Buddhist tradition, those who are familiar with it will know that impermanence and death contemplation is an important part of daily practice. And I know it's also in the Christian tradition, at least in the monastic Benedictine side of Christian tradition, it's an important part of daily meditation. And the idea of that is to really make us appreciate the value of being alive right now, so that we don't take it for granted, so that every moment is precious and every moment you live consciously. So I think, the Tibetan tradition says that the most spiritually advanced person, when they will go with joy. I'm not quite sure if I'm there, but the second type of person will go with no fear. And that least one should at least aim to live without remorse. That I think is doable. You know, you should, when the time comes for you to leave, if you can leave without remorse, that's a beautiful, graceful death, you know, exit.
What a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for all your thoughts and wisdom, Jinpa.
Thank you.
Thupten Jinpa Langri. Thank you so much.